Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story that sits halfway between science and dream. A slow, careful exploration of a mind who dared to say our world might be more like a code than a chair, and the strange silence that followed when he walked too close to the idea. Before we settle in and begin our peaceful journey, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if what I share here truly resonates with you. Your support helps me create more of these videos, and if you feel like it, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see the many corners of the world where we connect. Now, dim the lights, make yourself comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's journey together as we explore what lies ahead. Chapter 1. The Man Who Listened to Reality. Imagine a quiet room at dusk. The light through the window is soft, a slow amber that seems to move like memory. A young boy sits at a bedside holding his mother's hand. Outside, life continues in ordinary sounds, a neighbour sweeping a distant radio. But inside the room, everything narrows to one slow breath. His mother's illness is a map he cannot read, and the questions that follow are not the kind that fit neatly into textbooks. They settle instead in the parts of him that will not rest. This is how we begin with Jacobo Grinberg, not with a headline or an experiment, but with the gentle human reason that sent him toward the lab: grief, curiosity, and a longing for answers. He was 12 when his mother died of a brain tumour. That loss became a quiet engine. As he grew, the engine took him to psychology, to neurophysiology, to the hum of instruments, and the patient rhythm of measurement. He became a scientist in the most human way, driven by the wish that suffering might be understood, then softened. In the calm years after the laboratory doors opened, Grinberg pursued his PhD, set up a research space, and listened to the brain. He listened to the rhythms of the mind, the slow waves of sleep, the faster spikes of attention, the tiny signals that tell us we are here. He was, at first, a conventional scientist, careful, methodical, patient. But the world is a wide place, and sometimes, as in our own quiet lives, what we need comes from a doorway we did not expect to open. One such door opened in 1975, a formal invitation, an afternoon at Los Pinos, the presidential residence, and an introduction by someone who moved easily between the spheres of power and culture. Margarita López Portillo, the president's sister and a well-known supporter of indigenous traditions, brought Grinberg to a woman who would in time change his view of what the brain might touch. Her name, in the soft telling of the town, was Doña Pachita. On paper, she was a cabaret singer, a lottery seller, ordinary roles in the streets and markets. But in certain circles she was known as a healer, a shaman of a kind that bent the edges of what the material world usually allowed. The accounts of Pachita are gentle and wild at once. People would come to her in desperation, blindness that defied diagnosis, long barrenness, bodies worn down by ailments that resist the steady logic of medicine. Pachita would perform what on the surface looked like ritual. She would hold an old knife, an heirloom they said, and the gestures she made were precise but not surgical. Patients left bandaged. Sometimes wounds seemed to exist only under wrappings, sometimes nothing visible at all remained. For those who believed, the relief was real. For those who observed, the phenomenon was confounding. Grinberg, trained to measure and verify, did not scoff outright. He kept a scientist's discipline and a child's capacity for wonder. He watched. He took notes. The details he recorded later, the gestures, the ambience, the changes that followed, were written with the same steady hand he used in the lab. But what he saw unmoored something he had not expected to question: the relationship between mind and world. From these observations grew a particular idea, a way to speak about the strange malleability he perceived. He began to think in terms of an informational framework, an idea that beneath phenomena there might be a structure made of information, a kind of matrix of possibilities that consciousness accessed and, at times, modified. He used language like matrix, informational field, and later, formational metrics, phrases meant to bridge the language of tradition and the language of measurement. To Grinberg, shamans like Pachita were people who had learned to shift their role, from observer of the world to a speaker of its code. It's worth pausing here, long and slow, to notice how this idea feels. Think of a pond at night. The surface is glassy. A stone, a thought, an intention, touches that surface and the ripples rearrange what appears there. In Grinberg's view, human consciousness might sometimes be that stone, and shamans had learned where and how to throw it. He did not stop at metaphor. Grinberg wanted testable threads, ways to bring the poetic into the laboratory. So he designed experiments that felt, for him, honest and simple. One of his approaches involved pairs of people who meditated together, attempting to tune in to one another. He placed electrodes on their scalps to record brainwaves, the electrical murmurs that accompany thoughts, emotions, and attention. After a period of focused meditation, he separated the pairs. One participant would remain in a quiet room. The other would be exposed to a sequence of lights and sounds, stimuli the first person could not directly perceive. What occurred in some cases was quietly striking. When the exposed subject received flashes or tones, traces of simultaneous responses appeared in the partner's recorded brainwaves, small echoes in the EEG that, in a fraction of trials, seemed correlated. Grinberg reported rates of simultaneous activity that were above what chance would predict. He read these results in the softest way he could, as evidence perhaps of a background connection among minds, an informational field that might briefly entangle two consciousnesses. Skeptics, of course, gathered at the edges. Science asks for replicability, for controls that rule out leakage or bias. Could both subjects have been exposed somehow? Could the signals be artifacts? Grinberg knew these criticisms. They pushed him outward, not away. He refined methods. He wrote. He argued gently that if minds are part of a wider informational network, then the brain is both a receiver and sometimes a writer. While the academic world wrangled, other currents found him. In quiet offices far from Mexico City, intelligence agencies were experimenting with related ideas. The Cold War era, with its anxious search for advantage, created strange bedfellows, researchers of perception, military experimenters, and the curious minds in between. Projects sought to test remote viewing and the possibility that human attention could access distant events. Grinberg's work entered that context, not as a headline, but as a paper in a file, a name in a dossier. For him, the interest of state actors was a strange echo of public skepticism. People both feared and desired the capacities he explored. Back home, Jacobo wrote. He produced a large body of work that blended observation, theory, and a kind of gentle anthropology of the mind. One of his major undertakings, a multi-volume study of Mexican shamans, read like field notes and a laboratory logbook stitched together. He brought the methods of psychology to bear on rituals and translated folk accounts into experiments and diagrams. To many, the result was provocative. A scientist who refused to dismiss tradition because it did not fit the mainstream model. As the chapters of his life unfolded, the story grew both quieter and stranger. He proposed a model, sometimes called the curic or formational theory in his notes, where reality, at a deep level, resembled information waiting for an observer to bring it forth. This was not the Hollywood idea at all, not clumsy or violent. It was a careful proposal in which observers participate in the unfolding of phenomena by the way they attend, by the states of consciousness they occupy. Listen with me now to the small sounds of this thinking. Picture an EEG monitor, a modest screen, a row of soft lines. In the lab the air is warm and the machine hums like a distant insect. The pair of meditators breathe slowly, in time with one another. The experiment is less about flashy proof and more about patience, aligning attention, watching for the subtle choreography of brain rhythms. When an anomaly shows itself, a faint synchronous uptick in two charts, it is a small act of surprise, a soft punctuation on the long sentence of inquiry. Grinberg knew how dangerous small surprises could be. In science, extraordinary claims need extraordinary evidence. He attempted to scale experiments, to find settings that would be harder to dismiss. He imagined vast meditative gatherings, brain recordings tapped across continents, attempts to replicate entanglement on a large scale. This boldness, the plan to test connection across space, would later be part of his last known intentions. But even as he planned, the practical world pressed in. Colleagues who snubbed him, funders who grew impatient, social dynamics that made the pursuit of fringe ideas costly. And then, beyond the laboratory, there remained the story that had first led him here. The human ache at the source of his curiosity, unhealed and yet transforming into a kind of fierce patience. In the years after his early experiments, Grinberg became a storyteller of a different kind. He wrote with urgency and with tenderness about the ways a culture's memory could be a lens on human perception. He recorded the accounts of healers. He described Pachita's vanishings and reappearances, how, when threatened, she seemed to slip away from the reach of authorities and return unchanged years later. For Grinberg, these were not mere myths. They were data points in a larger map of how humans experience reality and what happens when attention bends in unusual ways. We will return in later chapters to the rhythms of Pachita's ceremonies, to the smell of herbs, the clack of beads, and the feeling of a hand held over an eye. We'll trace the lines between what a scientist can measure and what a community knows. For now, let us rest in the slow fact that a scientist was moved by what he saw to ask deeper questions, and that those questions led him toward an idea that would turn many heads and trouble some hearts. There is a tenderness in this kind of work, a patient sort of courage. To entertain the possibility that observation shapes the observed is to live inside a constant, quiet reckoning. Are we reading the world correctly? Are our instruments precise enough? Can the strange be measured without being tamed? Grinberg took that reckoning seriously. He tried to build bridges between instruments and ritual, between charts and chants, and in doing so, he opened a new room in the House of Inquiry. Before this chapter closes, allow a small promise to land softly in the mind. We will follow the thread of experiments, the slow diagrams of EEG reports, the notebooks filled with careful cursive. We will return to the details of the meditation trials, the criticisms he faced, and the ways he adjusted his methods. We will spend time with those who loved him. His daughter, who would later call for his return on television, his colleagues who debated with him in halls and at conferences, and the police officer who took the disappearance personally, who could not let the story rest. And because the human heart is seldom content with only data, we will also listen to the quieter, stranger stories, the claims of agents watching at a distance, the odd coincidences, and the many ways a disappearance can turn a life into a myth. Each of these threads will be given space to breathe and given time to be examined gently. For now, allow yourself to sink into the calm of the moment. Picture the lab once more, the slow blinking of an indicator light, the soft scratch of pen on paper, a cup of tea gone cold on the desk. Let the image sit at the edge of sleep like an ember that will be fanned delicately in the chapters to come. In the next part of our journey, we will open the notebook labelled Pachita and move slowly through the descriptions Grinberg recorded. The rituals, the instruments, the reactions. We will listen to the stories that shaped his hypothesis and ask in a slow, compassionate way what it means to argue that consciousness participates in the fabric of reality. Now we move slowly into Chapter 2, a quiet, close study of the people and practices that nudge Jacobo Grinberg into thinking differently. Tonight we sit with the healer he watched, and the methods he read like a scientist reads a score. We listen to ritual, to measurement, and to the thin line where belief and observation touch. Picture a small room with warm plastered walls. A single lamp throws a pool of light across a wooden table. There is the faint, steady scent of copal or anise, something herbal and familiar. People come in the way one approaches a lighthouse, gently, with a care for what might be revealed. They come with hope, with grief, with bodies that have tried everything else. They come to Doña Pachita. Doña Pachita's work was low-tech and high drama all at once. To the casual observer, her ceremonies looked more like theatre than medicine. She wore everyday clothes, sometimes a scarf across her head, and she carried an old knife, described in many accounts as a family heirloom, small and perfectly ordinary in the hand. What made her sessions uncanny was not the shine of a blade, but the ritual choreography, the placement of hands, the cadence of words, and the careful wrapping of bandages after an intervention that, on the surface, left no visible wound. One of the most quoted stories, and one that Grinberg recorded with deliberate attention, involved the great jazz musician who sought her help in desperation, Charles Mingus. In the calm of a hospital-like room, Mingus lay face down while Pachita performed her procedure. Later, under bandages, there was no blood, no clear incision, only the quiet testimony of the man who felt changed. These accounts didn't prove that a physical organ had appeared out of nothing. They did, however, offer something perhaps subtler and more important, an altered lived experience that, for the person receiving it, amounted to healing. Grinberg approached these scenes like an ethnographer and an experimentalist. He took field notes in small, precise handwriting, mapping not just what Pachita did, but what the space felt like. The placement of stools, the rhythm of speech, the responses of family members. He recorded the cadence of the ceremony as if transcribing a language, a ritual syntax that the healer and her followers used to coordinate shared expectation. From this attentive practice, Grinberg formed two kinds of observations. The first was social and psychological. Rituals regulate attention and expectation. When a community believes that a certain gesture or phrase has healing power, that belief is not a lie. It exerts real effects on perception, on pain thresholds, on hormone levels, and on immune responses. Modern psychology knows, in many circumstances, that expectation changes outcomes. Placebo effects are not false miracles. They are demonstrable physiological changes linked to belief and context. The second observation, the one that startled Grinberg more, was phenomenological. In certain moments, the world behaved as though attention itself were a causal factor. That is, something about the focused, shared attention of participants produced shifts that were not easily reduced to simple expectancy. He recorded moments in which witnesses described seeing tissue, organs, or movement where none had been before. Accounts that were internally consistent among multiple observers, yet resisted straightforward physical explanation. To bridge these observations, Grinberg turned to an idea that married anthropology and information theory. he proposed that certain altered states of consciousness, the kinds induced by deep ritual, meditation, or focused intent, change the brain's role in relation to the world. Normally, the brain acts as a reader of incoming sensory data. In these special states, he suggested, it might temporarily act as a writer, contributing to the unfolding of experience rather than only recording it. This is the heart of his curic or formational idea. Consciousness participates in the shaping of the observed world. It is important, calmly and clearly, to separate metaphor from claim. Saying that attention can shape perception is well within the realm of psychology. Saying that attention can produce new physical matter, that organs appear where none were before, moves us into a different category that requires extraordinary evidence. Grinberg tried to produce that evidence. His experiments were modest at first and then bolder. The paired meditator EEG studies are the most often cited. 2 participants would meditate together, building a mental link through shared imagery or intention. Electrodes recorded each brain's electrical rhythms. After a period of joint meditation, the participants were taken to separate rooms. One would experience controlled audio-visual stimuli. The other would be shielded. Grinberg reported cases where the shielded partner's EEG showed responses closely aligned in time with the stimuli the other person received. Correlations that, he argued, could not be explained by sensory leakage alone. A careful scientist's mind asks, how strong were these correlations? How were the trials randomized? And how many independent observers replicated the results? Critics pointed to possible confounds, unnoticed cues, insufficient blinding, statistical errors. Grinberg knew these criticisms and tried to design cleaner studies. He imagined larger international experiments with synchronized recordings across continents. Meditators in Kathmandu and Mexico, all taped and time-stamped, producing a dataset that would be harder to dismiss. He never completed that large-scale experiment. The reasons are part practical, funding, logistics, and part ominous, as we will later explore. Let us pause in a soft breath and consider alternative, scientifically grounded mechanisms that might explain what Grinberg observed without requiring us to accept miraculous physical transformations. First, neural synchrony and entrainment. The brain is a rhythmic organ. When 2 brains share a task, speech, or even eye contact, neurons can phase lock in subtle ways, their oscillations aligning temporarily. This synchrony can produce matched patterns in EEGs, especially when participants have previously shared a meditative context, and is a legitimate, measurable phenomenon that modern neuroscience studies under controlled conditions. Second, expectation and reporting bias. In high-stakes rituals, people want to believe. Memory and perception are malleable. If a person expects healing, they may detect sensations consistent with improvement. When multiple witnesses are invested in a narrative, their recollections may converge, not via fraud, but via social reinforcement. Grinberg, trained to be careful, sometimes struggled with how to factor such human tendencies into his interpretations. Third, placebo physiology. Rituals can release endorphins, modulate stress hormones, and alter immune responses. For many chronic conditions, pain, functional disorders, the ritual context can produce genuine, measurable relief. This doesn't explain apparent materializations, but it does account for why people testified to cures that otherwise seemed inexplicable. Fourth, methodological pitfalls. EEG is sensitive but coarse. It measures large-scale electrical fields generated by many neurons. Small artifacts, muscle movement, blinking, or equipment synchronization errors can produce patterns that, without rigorous controls, look like meaningful correlations. Grinberg's early work sometimes lacked the rigorous blinding later demanded by mainstream neuroscience, and yet, and here we soften our skepticism into curiosity, there remained anecdotal clusters that resisted neat explanation. Multiple independent witnesses sometimes described consistent phenomena, and Pachita's own reported vanishings, a pattern of disappearance and reappearance with no aging, added a layer of cultural mystery. When authorities pursued her, she would vanish from public notice for a time. Later she returned as though the interval had been a soft pause rather than a long absence. This combination, compelling social phenomena plus tantalizing experimental hints, is what made Grinberg's work haunting and controversial in equal measure. It placed him at the interface of anthropology and physiology, of folklore and statistics. He refused an easy boundary. He would not dismiss tradition merely because it did not fit current models, nor would he accept claims without attempting a rigorous test. We should also note the political ecology that surrounded these investigations. In Mexico, as in many other post-colonial contexts, indigenous practices were often marginalized or co-opted. Grinberg's sympathetic attention to shamans was itself a political act. It recentered knowledge systems the mainstream had long minimized. That reframing attracted both admiration and distrust. Powerful figures, including the president's sister, took an interest in promoting cultural heritage. At the same time, institutions fearful of unconventional authority kept a wary eye. Another sober thread to follow is the human cost of occupying the margins of science. Grinberg's career suffered for his heterodox interests. He lost professional respect in certain circles and found a strange new audience in intelligence services curious about psychic phenomena. The Cold War hunger for any edge meant that fringe science could be resourced and also manipulated. For Grinberg, attraction from secretive agencies was a complicated echo. It validated his work materially, while also exposing it to political entanglements that would later complicate investigations into his disappearance. Before we end this chapter, I want to tell you a small, quiet story that sits between the laboratory and the living room, a vignette Grinberg recorded in the margins of his field notes. One afternoon, after a long set of ceremonies, a woman returned to Pachita's courtyard carrying a bundle. Inside the bundle was a little girl who'd been blind since birth, her eyes clouded and unresponsive to light. The family had been told elsewhere that nothing could be done. Pachita took the child into a soft room, whispered something under her breath, made a few measured gestures with the knife, and wrapped a bandage with meticulous care. The child slept. When the bandage came off, the child's mother reported a new attention in the eyes, a small follow of movement towards sunlight. The change was not instantaneous restoration. It was subtle, partial, and the family's gratitude was a soft, sustained sound. Scientists who later re-examined such cases cautioned that spontaneous remission, suggestibility, or misperception could play a role. Yet for the family, that small improvement was a constellation of meaning. Hope had re-entered their lives. If we keep our perspective balanced and gentle, both the healer's effect and the scientist's rigor can coexist in the same story without collapsing into one another. Here is the lesson Grinberg sought to hold. Human experience is complex, and some phenomena sit in the borderline spaces between physiology and meaning, between communal ritual and individual cognition. His work invites us to approach those spaces with both methodological care and cultural humility. As the evening deepens, allow the images of the room to dissolve into a single calming thought. That inquiry can be both precise and tender. Grinberg's notebooks, with their diagrams and field sketches, are artifacts of that intention. They remind us that when a scientist listens, really listens, to a culture, new questions appear that are not reducible to old frameworks. In the next chapter, we will move from observation into theory. We will explore Grinberg's Curic model in greater detail, what he meant by an informational or formational matrix, how he translated shamanic practice into scientific language, and how his theoretical architecture attempted to explain the most puzzling of phenomena. We will walk slowly through the math-free core of his argument and the places where it met resistance. If you're still with me, rest here for a moment. Breathe slowly. Feel the steady inhale and exhale. Allow the sensations of the narrative, the thin light, the bandage, the hum of electrodes, to settle like soft dust on your thoughts. The story will unfold with care. There are many chapters ahead, each opening a new window into how a life and a theory can change the shape of our questions. Chapter 3. How a mind might touch the world. Imagine for a moment a quiet observatory of the mind. Its walls are not only lined with books, but also with small instruments that blink in steady rhythms, as if waiting patiently for their turn to reveal something hidden. At the front of the room stands a chalkboard. On it are simple diagrams, circles that overlap, waves that rise and fall together, arrows connecting one node to another. It feels less like a classroom and more like the workshop of someone trying to draw a map of the unseen. This is where Jacobo Grinberg tried to build a new language, one that could speak about something subtle and slippery. The possibility that consciousness is not merely a mirror reflecting reality, but at times a hand that reaches out and shapes it. Let us sit in that room tonight, moving slowly through his core ideas. We will not bury ourselves in equations, nor drown in complicated mathematics. Instead, we will walk carefully, step by step, through the images and metaphors he used, so that the thought feels clear, grounded and steady. Let each idea arrive, settle softly in your mind, and then make room for the next, as though we were following the rhythm of breath. Grinberg liked to begin with a simple picture. He compared consciousness to a device that operates in two modes, the reader and the writer. Most of the time, in our ordinary waking lives, the brain is the reader. It takes in streams of information from the senses, processes them into a model of the world, and lets us act within it. But, he suggested, there are rare moments when the system changes its role. In deep ritual, in long meditation, or in trance, the brain may become a writer. In writer mode, consciousness is not only receiving reality, but also participating in the act of generating it. This is not meant to sound overly mystical. Imagine a radio. Most of the time, you simply tune in to whatever station is broadcasting, and you listen passively. Yet, by adjusting the dial, you can decide which signal you will hear. Grinberg's claim was that consciousness does something similar. Most of the time it receives, but occasionally it shifts the channel, and in special circumstances it may even behave like an engineer who alters the signal itself. To describe this more precisely, Grinberg borrowed an image from information theory. Instead of imagining reality as a fixed, solid block of matter, he pictured it as a vast matrix of information, an underlying code that contains endless possibilities. Within this vision, the world is less like a carved statue and more like a script waiting to be performed. Conscious observers, by attending and interacting, bring parts of that script to life. Grinberg called this underlying structure the formational matrix, a hidden field of information that organizes potential experience. Think of it as a stage play. The script exists, and the stage exists, but the actors bring the energy that makes the play real in the present moment. The matrix is the script. Consciousness is the actor, and its attention is what allows particular outcomes to appear on the stage of lived reality. This helps explain why shamans fascinated him. Across many cultures, shamans are described as people who can slip into altered states, shift perception, and sometimes influence the world around them. Grinberg hypothesized that their rituals, steady rhythms, symbolic gestures, focused concentration, were practical techniques for moving from reader mode to writer mode. In that altered state, the boundary between what happens inside the mind and what unfolds outside becomes thinner, more permeable. The shaman's performance, therefore, is not just theatre. It is a disciplined reconfiguration of attention, an art that might leave measurable traces. But how do you measure something so elusive? Grinberg sought evidence. He turned to neuroscience, especially the electroencephalogram, or EEG, which records the brain's electrical rhythms through electrodes placed on the scalp. These rhythms form recognizable bands: slow delta waves, drowsy theta, calm alpha, quick beta, and rapid gamma, often linked to attention and integration. EEG does not reveal single neurons. It shows large-scale patterns across the brain. When two people display similar EEG rhythms at the same time, it suggests they are in a comparable brain state. And if such synchrony arises without sensory contact, it is worth asking whether something more unusual is happening. In his paired meditator experiments, Grinberg tested this directly. Two people would meditate together, aligning their imagery and intentions. Then they were separated. One participant was exposed to sudden flashes of light or bursts of sound, while the other sat in silence, shielded from any awareness of those stimuli. In some of these trials, Grinberg observed correlations, brief changes in the shielded person's EEG that lined up with the stimuli given to the partner. He interpreted these as signs of an informational link, faint but real, suggesting that two minds could remain entangled across space. His vision did not stop there. He imagined vast experiments spanning continents. Picture meditators in Mexico and Kathmandu, each connected to synchronized EEG machines, each following the same ritual protocol at the same global time. If simultaneous brain events appeared in both groups more often than chance would allow, it would be a harder result to dismiss, evidence less vulnerable to claims of coincidence or laboratory error. Of course, bold claims invite sharp criticism. Scientists questioned his methods, as they should. EEG is delicate, prone to contamination from muscle twitches, eye blinks, or background electrical noise. Results need replication across different labs to be trusted. Small samples can exaggerate patterns, and psychological factors, such as shared expectations or synchronized breathing, can also create apparent correlations. Grinberg acknowledged these concerns. Rather than dismiss them, he refined his methods, tightened his protocols, and called for broader collaborations. He wanted international experiments with pre-registered standards, audited data sets, and cleaner designs. For him, the challenge was not an obstacle but an invitation to do better science. His ideas also echoed certain philosophical currents. The physicist John Wheeler once suggested that the universe is not a fixed story, but a participatory one, where observation itself plays a role in shaping events. Grinberg's theory resonated with that spirit. But while physics speaks of quantum particles under controlled measurement, Grinberg spoke of human attention, ritual, and culture as forces that could shape lived experience. They were not the same claim, but they touched at a common point: observation matters. To imagine what convincing evidence might look like, Grinberg proposed a simple thought experiment. Picture two laboratories, carefully sealed and shielded, each with experienced meditators. An independent auditor controls the timing of stimuli so no one inside knows when they will occur. Both labs record EEG with modern precision, and the data are stored openly. if, across many repetitions, the shielded group's EEG consistently shows time-locked responses that match the stimuli of the other group, and if this finding replicates in independent labs, then even skeptics would be forced to pause. Such experiments were never fully realized in his lifetime, but the very outline of them shows the seriousness of his vision. Yet the work carried costs. Grinberg's ideas placed him on the margins of mainstream science. Some colleagues grew wary, while others, including certain intelligence agencies, grew intensely interested. That kind of attention came with its own dangers: secrecy, manipulation, and ethical shadows. Grinberg himself worried about misuse. If attention truly shapes experience, who should wield it? What happens if such methods are weaponized? These were not idle questions, but real concerns that haunted his later writings. Still, even without irrefutable proof, his research left behind small but lasting contributions. He showed that intentionality and shared focus can create measurable synchrony between brains. He encouraged scientists to respect indigenous practices, to study them with seriousness rather than dismiss them outright. He developed experimental designs that, with today's technology and larger samples, could still be revisited with greater rigor. And yet the mysteries remained. Stories of healers, of patients claiming impossible recoveries, of witnesses who swore to events that defied physics. All of these lingered at the edge of the data. They were not easily reduced to numbers, yet they could not be ignored either. They urged humility and perhaps a willingness to leave some questions open. As Grinberg's theory matured, his mind turned toward the future. He planned to launch a global meditation experiment, with hundreds of participants breathing together across different time zones, their brainwaves recorded and compared with exact precision. The vision was both beautiful and bold, a chorus of human attention stretching across the earth, tested with the discipline of science. It was this plan, more than any single experiment, that would define the shadow over his final days. The next chapter will follow the practical steps he took toward that goal, the notebooks he filled, the people he contacted, and the forces that began to take an interest in what he was building. But before we leave this room, imagine one last image, a circle drawn on the chalkboard, shaded gently at its center. Around it are tiny marks, symbols of people, instruments, ideas. Each mark is small on its own, yet together they form a pattern that hints at something greater. That circle is a map of Grinberg's life's work, modest elements gathered into a vision of how mind and world might touch. If you are still with me, take a slow breath, in and out. You do not need to accept every claim to sit with the questions. Let them float like lanterns in the night, waiting, glowing softly, guiding the way for those who choose to follow. In the next chapter, we'll leave behind metaphor and turn back to the laboratory. We will look directly at the experiments he actually ran, the raw notes he left behind, and the fragments of evidence that reveal both the promise and the ambiguity of his search. Chapter 4. Inside the Lab, Session by Session. Now we return to the laboratory, moving slowly into the small details that give a theory its true weight. Let us walk quietly through the rooms where Jacobo Grinberg worked, and take a seat with him at the instrument table. Around us, machines pulse with steady rhythms like slow mechanical hearts. Relays click softly in the background. Pages rustle as notes are written in a neat, deliberate hand. The air is calm, and everything seems designed for patience. Here we examine not speculation but practice, the experiments themselves, the sessions that unfolded one after another, and the small surprises that kept Grinberg searching. Picture the room with care. 2 comfortable chairs sit facing one another, a small table between them with a thermos of tea. while coils of cable lie ready like resting snakes. The electrodes are waiting too, small padded discs that serve as listening stations for the brain's electrical whispers. The lights are warm and low, not the harsh glare of hospital fluorescence, but a soft glow that allows participants to relax and drift toward the meditative states Grinberg believed were crucial. This was deliberate. He wanted a space that balanced scientific method with respect for the inner state of the mind. Every session began with quiet ritual. Participants were briefed, then given time to breathe slowly and settle into stillness. They synchronized their breathing, sometimes closing their eyes to imagine a simple shared image, a candle flame, a symbol, a word held softly in memory. This, Grinberg explained, created a common frame of attention, a subtle but steady thread that both minds could hold. Only after this alignment did the electrodes come into play. They were placed across the scalp in standard positions, frontal, central, temporal, occipital, so that the entire spread of brain rhythms could be recorded. The EEG ran continuously, time-stamped with precision, while assistants sat nearby noting every blink, every throat clearing, every cough, so artifacts could later be separated from meaningful signals. The logbook and the data trace were meant to speak to one another clearly. A typical paired session lasted about an hour. The first 20 minutes were devoted to shared practice, breathing together, settling into rhythm, building the common inner image. Then came the separation. Each participant was led to a different room, both insulated and kept electromagnetically quiet. One participant was exposed to a randomized sequence of light flashes or soft sound pulses, while the other remained in silence, holding the agreed image in mind. The final segment brought them together again for gentle debriefing, where they wrote down their inner experiences. From these sessions, Grinberg reported patterns. Not grand miracles, but small, intriguing signals. In some trials, the shielded participant's EEG displayed brief changes that coincided with the stimuli delivered to their partner. These were not constant, nor did they shout their presence. They appeared as subtle echoes, short-lived alignments in frequency bands, small bursts in alpha or beta, delicate duets in the rhythm of the brain waves. With restraint, he described them not as proofs, but as signals worth investigating further. One logbook entry, written in careful script, described a trial with two partners who had trained together for days. At 14:23:07, one participant received a 3-second light pattern. 2 seconds later, the shielded partner's EEG showed a clear but modest burst in the alpha band, above their usual baseline. Grinberg's note read simply, "No muscular artifacts, no auditory bleed." Both rooms verified sealed. His words were cautious, suggestive, never definitive. Another note told of a participant who later reported a sudden inner image, a flash of grey. The timing of the description matched the EEG shift that had occurred in response to the partner's stimulus. These moments where subjective report and brain trace aligned mattered deeply to Grinberg. For him, they suggested not only electrical correlation, but also lived, experiential correspondence. Conscious of skepticism, he worked to strengthen his protocols. Curtains and heavy sound insulation reduced sensory leaks. In some sessions, he used Faraday shielding to minimize electromagnetic interference. Stimulus times were randomized so participants could not guess them. Technicians were trained to remain blind to conditions whenever possible, and raw EEG data was archived carefully, an early instinct toward transparency in an era before open data was common. Even so, limitations remained. EEG is strong in timing but coarse in resolution. It shows large patterns across the brain but cannot reveal the firing of individual neurons, nor can it prove causation. Synchrony, even if detected, might only indicate correlation. Grinberg admitted this openly in his notes. often writing of the need for more advanced tools and stricter statistical safeguards. When you sit with his logs, a rhythm emerges. Many sessions showed nothing unusual, but scattered among them were the intriguing ones, the signal trials. He estimated that a minority of experiments produced correlations that seemed to exceed chance. These faint sparks kept him motivated, pushing him toward the dream of larger, cleaner tests. Small hints in the lab, he felt, deserved to be planted in broader ground. His notebooks also reveal the human side of the science. He recorded when a participant laughed nervously, or when another grew emotional during debrief, recalling a personal memory that surfaced during meditation. He noted when fatigue dulled performance, when stress or distraction interfered. He understood that the human mind is not a machine. It shifts with mood, rest, and expectation. This recognition shaped his protocols. Rest was emphasized, selection of participants became thoughtful, and training was patient. Perhaps most honourable of all, Grinberg documented his failures. He didn't hide the flat sessions, the hours where no synchrony appeared, or the nights when all he found were blank lines. He preserved them, understanding that a true science includes silence alongside signal. Those null results humbled him, sharpened his methods, and kept the work honest. Some colleagues tried to replicate his methods. Their results varied. Some saw nothing, while others glimpsed faint echoes that stubbornly resisted consistency. Replication is the hardest test in science, and without it, even the most fascinating findings remain uncertain. Grinberg knew this well. The frustration of fragile signals haunted him, but it also drove him to refine again and again, never abandoning rigour for spectacle. Ethics, too, shaped his approach. He avoided exploiting vulnerable people. His participants volunteered freely, often drawn by curiosity or meditation experience. He was cautious about public claims, worrying that exaggeration could harm communities or lead to misplaced hopes. These concerns appear again and again in his writing, like gentle guardrails keeping him from sliding into sensationalism. If we translate his work into plain language, the message is clear. He found repeated but fragile hints that minds in shared states could display synchronized activity. They were enough to suggest larger, more rigorous experiments, but they did not amount to proof that consciousness creates matter or rewrites biology. Grinberg respected that distinction, holding firmly to scientific temper even while studying ideas that many found extraordinary. Still, the sparks encouraged him. He began sketching plans for larger experiments, synchronized recordings across cities, then nations, and eventually continents. He dreamed of exact time-stamped EEGs, of shared protocols, of independent auditors to safeguard credibility. The obstacles were immense: equipment costs, time synchronization, funding. But the vision grew. In his journals, sketches became maps and maps became proposals. It was scientific ambition at its most human, taking the faintest of signals and daring to scale them into something the world could no longer ignore. So let us pause and breathe. Imagine one of those moments, a faint uptick in the EEG wave, the kind that made Grinberg lean forward, mark the time, and whisper to himself, "This is interesting. We must try again." That patience, that willingness to repeat and refine, is the true heart of this chapter. In the next part of our story, we will follow him out of the lab and into the world of preparation. The letters he wrote, the collaborators he sought, the plans he laid for continental synchrony. We will also encounter the shadows that gathered around him: bureaucracy, politics, and the watchful eyes of agencies who cared for reasons very different from science. Chapter 5: Collaborators, Logistics, and the Weight of Interest. As the days folded into months, Jacobo's idea moved from private notebooks to the edges of a plan that required hands beyond his own. He began to gather a small circle of collaborators, colleagues who shared a patient curiosity rather than quick certainty, technicians who understood equipment and its temper, and meditators who had practiced the steady, shared attention his protocol required. The work of scaling an experiment is quiet and meticulous. Emails written with care, polite refusals, the slow arithmetic of budgets, the careful balancing of skepticism and imagination. In these hours, Grinberg's world was mostly phone calls at dusk and notes left under the warm lamp on his desk. He reached out to meditation centres and to teachers known for disciplined practice. He spoke with engineers who could help with time-stamped recordings, and with statisticians who would remind him gently what counts as convincing evidence. There were long conversations about training. How long should pairs meditate together before separation? How to ensure that the imagery they shared would be specific enough to count as a common frame, yet general enough to be repeatable across many teams. These were not glamorous questions. They were the slow scaffolding of any rigorous test. The logistical problems loomed large and mundane. EEG machines of the era were not plug-and-play across borders. Ensuring synchronized timestamps across continents before GPS-synced clocks became standard was a technical headache. They discussed secure third-party auditors to randomize stimulus times, independent labs to host blinded trials, and archival procedures so that raw data could be examined by others. Funding was another patient fight. Grants for unconventional projects are often small, contingent on conservative milestones. Jacobo learned how to make careful proposals that emphasize methodological safeguards and practical value, mindful of how easily ambition could be dismissed as frivolity without rigor. All of this planning had a human rhythm. Some people answered with polite curiosity, others were blunt about professional risk. A few seasoned researchers offered quiet support if not public endorsement. Young technicians were eager to try new synchronization methods. In the evenings, Jacobo sketched flowcharts with tentative dates and lists of names, and each name carried a face and a story. A woman who had practiced a lifetime of focused attention, a professor who had bent his career towards studying perception, an engineer who loved time codes like a musician loves rhythm. These were the small constellations he hoped to align. The political and institutional context threaded through the process, not as drama but as practical reality. Governments and intelligence agencies had, in various countries, invested quietly in research on remote perception during the Cold War. Papers and declassified files later showed interest in psychic phenomena for potential intelligence applications. For someone working at the intersection of attention and perception, such interest could be both validating and unnerving. It meant resources sometimes arrived, but so did opacity. Jacobo felt the pull of practical support and the squeeze of secrecy. He did not relish clandestine entanglements. He wanted open science. Still, accepting some help could accelerate experiments that otherwise would take years to fund. Within his personal life, pressures accumulated. Professional marginalization in mainstream academia is a subtle weight. Invitations to conferences that once came easily were slower to arrive. Referee reports sometimes colder than deserved. Colleagues who preferred distance. The attention from intelligence entities added another layer. He was wary of his work being used in ways that would contradict his ethics. He wrote often about the moral responsibilities of studying consciousness. At home, relationships frayed. He slept less at his flat. Friends noticed him taking late-night drives and sometimes choosing the solitude of a parked car over the intimacy of a home that felt complicated. Those who knew him later described a man increasingly protective of his notes, shifting toward a particular focus that bordered on obsession. Threats, or the sense of being watched, are not always cinematic. They arrive as small changes in routine. The feeling that a conversation had been overheard, a stranger who seems to appear too often, the sense that one's mail is not as private as it should be. In Jacobo's case, friends and later investigators reported moments when he seemed to sense attention on him in a new way. He mentioned being followed, not in a frantic tone, but in the tired voice of someone cataloguing oddities. A few witnesses would later recall men in suits near places he frequented. Whether they were protectors, agents of interest, or mere coincidence, these details added an uneasy texture to the final months of planning. Domestic tensions added to the strain. His marriage was frayed. Arguments about attention, privacy, and trust began to feature in his private notes. Some in his circle suspected his partner of being less than straightforward. Others urged caution about assigning motive. In the midst of these complications, Jacobo doubled down on the work. The global experiment remained his North Star. If he could demonstrate reproducible correlations across continents, the result would be difficult to ignore. To prepare practically, he started small and methodical. He travelled to cities where collaborators were most receptive, testing synchronization methods between labs in the same time zone before attempting the far-reaching plan. He refined protocols for participant selection, insisting on meditation experience and clear informed consent. He created training manuals for technicians to reduce the chance of equipment error. He held mock sessions where timings were randomized and where independent observers watched the process, noting that the presence of an observer changes the character of any experiment. A paradox he acknowledged in his writings. Alongside these sober efforts, rumours and myths grew in the public imagination. Reports of intriguing cures at the hands of Doña Pachita, her disappearances when authorities pressured her, and the stories of patients whose lives seemed transformed contributed to a cultural fabric where Jacobo's ideas made sense to some and implausible to others. He navigated that cultural landscape with restraint, attempting to translate compelling stories into testable hypotheses rather than allowing narrative to outrun evidence. As the plan grew, so did the number of hands involved. Letters were written to officials in distant cities, proposals sent to potential funders, and invitations extended to meditation centres in Kathmandu and beyond. Technical rehearsals were scheduled. Equipment lists were checked twice. The project's ambition inspired generosity from some quarters, donated equipment, volunteered time from technicians, and invitations from centres willing to host pilot sessions. At the same time, progress was slow. International shipping of delicate gear, bureaucratic paperwork for cross-border experiments, and the simple human need to coordinate calendars across time zones all conspired to delay the full-scale test. The emotional tone of this phase was not frantic, but persistent. In his journals, Jacobo wrote with a mixture of excitement and long-suffering patience. He described late nights drafting protocols and early mornings fielding calls from collaborators, the repetition of small tasks, calibrating devices, confirming training dates, double-checking randomization scripts, became a form of disciplined meditation itself. The work required him to be both a theorist and an organizer, a thinker and a project manager. Then came the personal choices that widened the mystery for those who later looked back. He began to travel more alone. He slept in his car at times, a fact that worried friends and family. He spoke of going to Kathmandu as if the trip were a necessary, perhaps even sacred final test. In private conversations, he sometimes hinted that the international experiment would be the hinge on which his theory turned from provocative suggestion to substantial evidence. The tone of those remarks was not boastful, it was resolute. As plans accumulated, small conflicts and odd events added pressure. One of his collaborators reported being warned informally to avoid speaking publicly about certain aspects of the work. Another received an unexpected phone call from an official who expressed interest in the project's potential uses, not as a curiosity but as an instrument. These conversations altered the emotional landscape. Some collaborators retreated, others continued quietly, and Jacobo pressed ahead with a mixture of pragmatism and stubbornness. Finally, the practical preparations reached a point where departure seemed imminent. Tickets, equipment boxes with serial numbers and fragile labels, lists of time-synced protocols. These were the outward signs that the long dream of a coordinated experiment was about to become action. The evening before his planned trip, he made a few last calls, wrote a note to a close friend about timing, and placed his notebooks in a bag. People who would later comb through his last days would find traces of this ordinary diligence, itineraries, a few hurried messages, and a sense that the plan was no longer an idle sketch, but a movement toward realization. And then, in the hush after that busy preparation, the space opened for the final, startling silence. It is in that space, between the practical steps he took to bring many people together and the day he vanished, that the narrative grows heavy with questions. Was the experiment interrupted by forces he could not control? Was the timing of his disappearance coincidental with the complexity of international arrangements? Did personal tensions play a decisive role? Or did the interest of outside agencies, for reasons practical or secretive, make his presence problematic? We will move gently, in the next chapter, into the final weeks, the very last communications, the small signs friends noticed, the reports of being followed, and the moment when his family realized he had not returned. We will do so with care, remembering the difference between conjecture and fact, and giving space to both the human tenderness of those who loved him and the cold mechanics of an investigation that would follow. For now, breathe slowly and feel the faint weight of preparation, the packing of cables, the careful sealing of data boxes, the patience of nights spent coordinating people across oceans. These are the ordinary acts that make extraordinary projects possible. They're also sometimes the last visible footprints before a life's trajectory takes an unexpected turn. Chapter 6. The Vanishing. Last days, the search, and the quiet work of investigation. The last visible days of Jacobo's life unfold like a sequence of small motions that, when gathered together, begin to form a pattern that is at once ordinary and disquieting. In the weeks before he vanished, he moved through his careful routines, calibrating equipment, confirming time codes, writing protocols, making phone calls across time zones. But the texture of those days had a different feel than earlier experiments. There was an urgency that was not showy. It lived in the tightening of schedules, the repeated checking of itineraries, and the way he sometimes chose the solitude of his car to sleep, rather than the uncertainty of home. These are human details that matter, a man bent toward a long scientific task, growing wary of domestic friction, protective of notebooks that meant so much to him. On December 8th, 1994, the ordinary cadence stopped. At first, no one rushed to declare alarm. He had been a private man who travelled and who sometimes went quiet for days. After 4 days, however, concern sharpened into action. Family members expected him at a birthday gathering that did not happen. Calls went unanswered. The sense that something was wrong grew. A missing person report was filed, and the public record of small, meticulous steps became official. Police logs, interviews, the slow administrative machinery that begins when a person cannot be found. The early investigation moved at first with the uncertainty of not knowing where to look. Jacobo had written of a planned trip to Kathmandu in private conversations, and that suggested he might be abroad. Family and police checked airports and travel records. The first clear fact that pushed the case toward a narrower field was the passport audit. There was no record of him leaving Mexico. If he had not crossed an international border by plane, then either he had left by other means, an unlikely possibility given checks at road crossings, or he remained somewhere within the country. This narrowed the search and for a time reframed what had been a global worry into a local mystery. When investigators broadened their inquiry, domestic witnesses became crucial. There were calls from people claiming sightings, and at first these brought the family a fragile hope. Many of the tips crumbled under scrutiny. Memory is a soft thing, and mistaken identification is common when a missing person's face is plastered on the news. Yet one sighting stood out as oddly specific. A woman walking her dog near Boulder, Colorado, later told police she had seen a man resembling Jacobo, apparently followed by two men in suits. She knew his face, she said, from an article in Scientific American. Her description included details that made investigators sit up. The man walked calmly and did not appear to be evading the followers. He seemed now to be aware of them and to accept their presence. Officer Clemente Padilla, the investigator who later described this case as the one he never solved, followed this thread. Padilla used his connections to query international intelligence channels, and the trail brought him to an unexpected place. A contact with a US intelligence officer identified the two men the witness had seen. Rick Howard and Marina Velasco, names that to that agent were not strangers. For Padilla, the implication was terrible and fascinating. If true, it suggested a level of surveillance or involvement that ran beyond local concerns. He pressed for cooperation between agencies, for formal channels of inquiry that could confirm whether foreign operatives had been near or around Jacobo during the days before his disappearance. The reply from the Mexican authorities, however, was not what a dogged investigator might hope for. Padilla found himself removed from the case by his superiors, an unexpected administrative action that chilled the momentum of the search. Reasons offered were bureaucratic. Grievances and hearsay followed. The effect, whatever the motive, was that a promising investigative thread was severed. The case file, later complainants would say, went cold in official hands. Key documents and lines of inquiry were allowed to fade. Grinberg's family pressed on, broadcasting pleas on television and offering rewards. His daughter Astucia, with a measured desperation, appeared on American broadcast to appeal for help. The phones rang with tips, and for a while the family clung to each call as if it might be an oar that would pull them back to shore. The human texture of the investigation is peppered with small telling details. Friends described Jacobo in his last weeks as guarded, sometimes afraid of his own home, sometimes moving at odd hours. He spoke of being followed in a voice that did not seem hysterical but was marked by a new fatigue. He left trailing traces like itineraries, a sandwich of careful notes, messages to friends, and a bag packed with his notebooks. To those who loved him, the fragmentation was wrenching. A scientist who had given himself to a controversial work, arrested by both the thrill of discovery and the loneliness of marginalization, now unaccounted for. As days slipped into weeks and then years, multiple theories took root. The presence of intelligence interest, documents later declassified, would show that US agencies had files that referenced Grinberg and similar projects, made an obvious narrative simple to construct. Perhaps an agency took a man they thought useful into protection, or into a classified program. That thesis had charms of logistic plausibility, but also moral discomfort. Why would an agency make someone disappear in a way that left families bereft and an academic legacy suddenly shadowed by secrecy? Protection could have been arranged more compassionately if that were the aim. Sabotage of research was a more Machiavellian possibility. Disrupt the international experiment, make the project appear fruitless, and the theory would fade as its author vanished. Yet those explanations, while neat, also beg a question. What motive would justify such heavy hands when less destructive alternatives existed? Another theory centered on local politics. Pachita's legacy had long been entangled with political sensitivity. Ritual healers in Mexico had clashed with authorities across decades. Grinberg's association with such traditions and his public interest in them might have made him uncomfortable collateral when power and suspicion intertwined. Padilla's removal from the case by Mexican officials fed this line of thought. Was the state protecting itself from embarrassment, or were other forces at play? Again, this line of explanation fits some of the emotional data but does not easily account for the presence of men with American intelligence ties cited abroad. A domestic theory focused on interpersonal conflict. Jacobo's second wife, Teresa, became a person of interest in the eyes of some family members and investigators. Arguments in the marriage, odd comportment, and later actions by Teresa, her own vanishing a year after Jacobo, added a dark human dimension. Family members described strange behaviour and suspected that she might have been more than she claimed. She withdrew, moved, and eventually disappeared. A sequence of events that creates a pattern of suspicion and sorrow. In the absence of definitive proof, these personal narratives thrum with the ache of human relationships gone wrong, motives tangled in jealousy, fear, and secrecy. And then there is the most poetic, the most extraordinary theory, that Jacobo had found a literal way to step outside the reality he described, that he used methods he had studied and observed in others to exit our shared frame. This explanation appeals to the symbolic logic of his life, a scientist who studied the boundary between observation and being, who wrote of shamans who vanished and returned unchanged, who imagined that consciousness could alter the fabric of what we call real. To believe this fully requires a leap from empirical caution into mythic imagination. Yet in a story where vanishings had precedent in Pachita's lore, where reports of reappearances embroidered the cultural memory, the theory circulated among followers with a kind of gentle conviction. It is, in its own way, a hopeful theory. A man who left rather than was taken. None of these narratives prove what happened. What the record shows is a mix of cold, bureaucratic files, vivid but sometimes unreliable human testimony, intermittent investigative will, and an archive that grew thin. Officer Padilla's frustration became emblematic. A competent investigator who found surprising leads, then watched them cool under administrative pressure. The family's activism kept the case in public memory but could not, on its own, force the full accounting that friends and colleagues sought. There are quiet pieces that matter. The notebooks Jacobo carried, the careful logs of experiments, the letters to collaborators, all were traces of a life committed to asking difficult questions. Some papers survived, others were never recovered. The absence of his notebooks from public circulation added to the mystery. Without those stacks of marginalia and detailed protocols, later researchers lacked the raw material Jacobo believed would allow others to continue his work with clarity and method. As the investigation moved through the years, the disappearance became part of a larger cultural story, about scientists marginalized for asking strange questions, about the human hunger for answers that straddled disciplines, and about the practical consequences of attention from state actors in an era when secret programs were eager for unconventional leads. The narrative did more than recount a vanishing. It suggested how the life of one person could illuminate the tensions between curiosity and power. We will explore these theories in coming chapters with patient care. We will examine the declassified files that mention his name, the accounts of those who claim to have seen him, the peculiar administrative decisions that stalled certain lines of inquiry, and the later vanishing of Teresa. We will trace what was found and what was not, taking time to weigh motive, method, and the limits of available evidence. For now, let the quiet quality of this chapter settle, the last weeks of a life that had been devoted to listening to the mind, the frantic calls of a family that searched for him, and the slow, often imperfect machinery of an investigation that met bureaucratic resistance. If you're still with me, rest your gaze on a single image, a packed bag with notebooks, a ticket stub tucked inside, a streetlight reflected off a parked car where a tired man slept for the night. These are ordinary sights that, in the end, remind us the world is made of small things that can unravel larger plans. We will continue to follow the threads, calmly and carefully in the chapters ahead. Chapter 7. The Theories Unspooled. Motives, Possibilities, and the Stories We Tell. After the immediate scramble of the search, the silence around Jacobo's disappearance quieted into a slow, persistent questioning. People who loved him, people who'd worked with him, and those who only knew his name through newspapers or late-night conversations all began to assemble possible explanations like small lamps placed around a room. Each theory lit something different and left other corners in shadow. In the weeks, months, and years that followed, these lamps multiplied, some steady and sober, others flickering with rumour or desire. To move through them calmly, let us sit with each possibility in turn, breathing slowly, and consider what it would mean if it were true, what evidence supports it, and what problems it leaves unresolved. One of the first stories people told was the intelligence story. Jacobo's work had, by his own admission, and by later archival breadcrumbs, been of interest to agencies curious about remote perception and altered states. The Cold War-era projects that sought any edge, even in apparently marginal phenomena, had budgets and quiet attention. Archives that would later be opened in other contexts show programs that tested remote viewing and psychic research for national security. In that climate, it is not hard to imagine that researchers working on the edges of perception might find themselves on the radar of people who thought about practical applications as much as theory. For some, the idea that an intelligence agency might have intervened in Jacobo's life to control his work, recruit him, or even make him disappear is a tidy narrative. It explains secrecy, sudden silence, and the air of official obfuscation that followed Officer Padilla's removal from the case. But tidy narratives ask for evidence, and evidence in this instance is brittle. The most compelling detail in this lane was the reported sighting in Boulder, Colorado. A credible witness who recognized the scientist from a magazine photograph and observed him accompanied by two suited individuals later identified by an intelligence contact as persons of interest. If true, the sighting would be a strong pointer towards some institutional involvement that crossed borders. Yet the next step, a fully documented, publicly verifiable chain of custody showing who met him, when, and where, did not solidify. Padilla's inability to keep his fingertips on the thread because of administrative removal left the lead dangling. The result was a theory that felt plausible to many but could not be proven without those missing links. Another lamp in the room was political motive closer to home. Grinberg's interest in shamans and in a Mexican cultural heritage that authorities had sometimes reshaped or suppressed placed him within a political terrain that was complicated. Pachita's own run-ins with law enforcement, times when she vanished and later reappeared, unaged and unbowed, created a background in which state actors had historically acted against perceived threats to social order. If local political forces mistrusted the spread of non-institutional authority, then Grinberg's visibility and his public championing of traditional practices might have been uncomfortable for officials who preferred cultural narratives that supported state control. The administrative friction that sidelined diligent investigators like Padilla fed this suspicion. Was the Mexican bureaucracy protecting itself, or were other concerns at play? The trouble with this explanation is similar to the trouble with the intelligence one. It fits the tenor of certain facts but lacks the smoking gun. It points to motive but not to a clear chain of action. A quieter, more domestic lamp focused on interpersonal dynamics. Family narratives and some investigators turn their attention to Jacobo's personal life. Tensions in his marriage, allegations of emotional abuse, and strange behaviours by his second wife, Teresa. Personal betrayal is the most human of all motives, and it is sadly common in missing person cases. The oddities surrounding Teresa, inconsistent statements, movements that didn't line up with declared plans, and her own later disappearance, fed the rumour mill. For some relatives and acquaintances, the simplest explanation was the most plausible, that the vanishing had something to do with private conflict that tragically escalated. For others, the idea of a spouse as a perpetrator felt too raw to accept without stronger proof. Either way, the domestic explanation remains stubbornly possible because it requires only motives that exist in the everyday: jealousy, fear, control, and a small set of actors rather than a conspiracy of institutions. Yet it cannot explain sightings abroad or the involvement of intelligent contacts that Officer Padilla reported, unless those were red herrings or coincidences. A different sort of lamp, the one that sits on the windowsill where myth meets memory, offered an explanation that plays directly to the heart of Jacobo's work. Perhaps he left intentionally, stepping beyond the familiar pattern of life in the way some had seen Pachita do. This theory is at once the most poetic and the most difficult to treat within the conventions of ordinary inquiry. Pachita's reputed vanishings, moments when, under pressure, she seemed to slip from legal reach and then return unchanged, became a touchstone for those who knew Grinberg's work intimately. If a shamanic tradition could produce stories of passage out of ordinary reality, and if he had spent years studying how attention and altered states could shape experience, then maybe the man who wrote about stepping from reader to writer had applied the technique to his own life. To consider this without mockery or blind acceptance, we must translate it into testable claims. The assertion, at its most basic, is that some practices can dramatically alter subjective experience to the point where a person's ordinary pattern of interaction ceases in a way that appears to others as disappearance. This could be literal if the practice produced a physical relocation outside the ordinary frame, or it could be social and psychological, meaning the person withdraws so completely that all traces vanish. Both variants are possible without invoking supernatural agency. The first is astonishing. It would require extraordinary evidence. The second is tragic, but explainable within human behaviour. The poetic theory resonates because it preserves coherence between Jacobo's life and the mythic qualities of the rituals he studied. It also resists easy verification, leaving it lingering as a moving, unresolved possibility rather than a conclusion. There are other lamps too, smaller and more speculative. The idea that corporate or private actors might have had motives to suppress his work, or that random violence resulted in his death and subsequent loss of records. Each suggestion has a human weight to it, and each pushes us to ask what counts as sufficient evidence in a tangled social world. In the wake of these competing stories, official action slowed, stopped, and sometimes restarted in fits and starts. Padilla's removal became a symbol of institutional inconsistency. Declassified documents that later surfaced showed that certain intelligence programs had files referring to people and projects in the domain Jacobo worked in, but those documents rarely told the whole story. They contained shorthand notes, curiosity-driven memos, and bureaucratic hedges that are typical of long-running programs. To translate those fragments into a direct narrative about intervention or protection would require leaps that the archive does not support cleanly. For Jacobo's family and for the small community of scholars and meditators who'd gathered around his work, the result felt unsatisfying. There was the ache of unanswered questions and the pragmatic frustration of losing access to notebooks and raw data that might have allowed a clearer reconstruction of his final plans. Without his field notes, later researchers had to work from published work, second-hand accounts, and the small cache of surviving records, like trying to rebuild a cathedral from a handful of keystones. That scarcity shaped the next generation of responses. Some researchers, inspired by the curiosity of his experiments, tried to replicate his EEG studies using the modern tools now available: denser electrode arrays, better artifact rejection, time-synced instrumentation that connects labs with millisecond precision. Those attempts produced interesting data about brain synchrony in people who meditate together, about the social physiology of rhythm and attention, but they did not produce dramatic physical rematerializations or indisputable telepathic artifacts. In many ways, that is an important result. It suggests that Grinberg's small signals were likely to be subtle, context-dependent, and perhaps amplified by factors his original designs could not fully control. Modern neuroscience tends to view shared intentional states as producing measurable coordination, matched heart rates, aligned breathing, correlated neural oscillations, and those are real, replicable phenomena. They do not, however, constitute proof of minds altering matter in ways that would satisfy a stringent standard of extraordinary evidence. This boundary between measurable social neuroscience and the more extravagant claims of physical transmutation is where most contemporary researchers place themselves, intrigued by the social and neural consequences of shared attention, skeptical of claims that exceed what the data show. Yet Grinberg's influence extends beyond the narrow question of whether shamans can create organs out of nothing. He shifted how some people think about attention and culture. By insisting that traditional practices be treated with methodological respect, rather than dismissed as mere superstition, he encouraged cross-disciplinary work that blends field anthropology, cognitive science, and careful experimental design. That legacy is one of intellectual humility, to acknowledge that human experience has a richness that sometimes resists simple categorization, and to insist that our methods be strong enough to explore that richness. As the years passed, a subtle myth grew around the disappearance itself. For some, the unresolved quality of the case lent his ideas a kind of charged credibility. If a man who proposed the mind participates in reality vanishes without trace, perhaps the theory contains an operative kernel of truth. For others, the disappearance is a cautionary tale about the social and professional hazards of occupying the margins. Both readings are human responses to ambiguity, an attempt to make narrative sense from a fragmentary archive. In the quiet of the present, if we step back and breathe with detachment, several reasonable conclusions emerge. First, Jacobo was a careful scientist with a deep curiosity, and that curiosity led him to study practices that mainstream science often neglected. Second, his experiments produced small, intriguing signals that justified further, more rigorous investigation. Third, the political, personal and institutional complexities that swirled around his life created an environment where disappearance could be interpreted in many ways but verified in few. And fourth, the case itself functions as a mirror. It reflects our cultural appetite for mystery, our discomfort with unanswered questions, and our simultaneous yearning for clear proof and poetic meaning. In the chapters to come, we will trace the post-disappearance landscape, the attempts to archive and preserve what remains of his writings, the work of devotees and detractors who kept the conversation alive, and modern research that has re-examined his ideas through the lens of contemporary neuroscience and cultural studies. We will listen, patiently, to interviews and testimonies that survived, and we will pay special attention to Officer Padilla's account, the one case he never managed to close, because the path of diligent investigation reveals as much about institutions as it does about individuals. Rest for a moment on the simple image of a circle of lamps. Each light has its warmth and its limitation. No single lamp illuminates the whole room. The wise watcher will walk between them and hold more than one story at a time. Because ambiguity is a natural state in human affairs where motives are mixed and evidence is partial. Grinberg's life and vanishing invite that posture, a careful curiosity that honours what is known, accepts what is not, and remains willing to look again. Chapter 8. Records, declassified files, and what the archives tell us. There is a particular intimacy to reading an old file, the soft rustle of paper, the faint scent of ink and time, the corners turned by hands that are no longer in the room. In the case of Jacobo, the archives were part revelation and part riddle. Over the years, fragments of paperwork, memos and agency notes surfaced in unexpected places, small windows through which cautious light fell on a larger, darker room. These documents did not give us a single clear answer, but they offered textures, the bureaucratic curiosity of the Cold War, a measured interest in unconventional cognition, and the way agencies catalogued phenomena they could not easily classify. Reading them is like listening to a conversation through a wall. You hear words and tones, but the whole meaning requires patient reconstruction. The first thing to understand about the archive is that it is rarely tidy. Intelligence files, project memos, and research summaries are often shorthand for deeper deliberations, and their language is cautious by design. When a Cold War-era project writes a line about remote perception or peace-eye research, the sentence sits in a folder among others: funding proposals, meeting notes, cost estimates, and personnel lists. Such documents show interest. They show that researchers like Jacobo are on someone's radar. They rarely show explicit directives unless declassification reveals more. So the presence of Jacobo's name or references to his work in these folders tells us that his ideas reached beyond academic curiosity into circles that considered practical application. Another tenderness of these papers is their human traces. A handwritten margin note, an exasperated line about budget constraints, or a typed summary that betrays excitement. They show how organizations approach the unfamiliar with pragmatic agendas. Could these phenomena, if real, be harnessed? Could mental training be useful in scenarios where conventional sensors and satellite imagery were limited? These are the questions that some officials asked quietly and without ceremony. The archive does not prove nefarious action. Rather, it shows a pattern of institutional curiosity that crossed borders and disciplines during a tense geopolitical era. At the same time, the records are incomplete. Missing pages, redactions, and documents that never made it into public circulation leave gaps. Those absences became fertile ground for speculation. If the file is redacted, what is hidden? If the chain of custody for a lead is broken, who cut it? For grieving families and devoted followers, gaps are more than inconvenience. They become meaningful silences that feel like part of the story itself. For a careful listener, however, the gaps also demand humility. Archivists remind us that what is not in the file may be absent for technical reasons, misfiling, deterioration, or categorization under unrelated project names. The archive's silence is not automatically evidence of conspiracy. It is often painfully bureaucratic entropy. What the available documents do allow us to reconstruct is a rough map of interactions. Researchers interested in altered states communicated with program officers who wrote summary memos, and sometimes technicians wrote feasibility notes about synchronizing equipment across continents. There were informal exchanges with officials who saw potential operational utility, notes about whether a claimed capacity could be trained, measured, or transferred across contexts. These exchanges were typically cautious. Promising but unproven is the tone more often than "this will change everything." The measured character of these memos is a small comfort. It shows that agencies treated such claims with the same care they would bring to any nascent technology. Alongside institutional documents were correspondence and archived field notes from Jacobo and his collaborators. These pages reveal a scientist who worried about controls, who drafted protocols late into the evening, and who argued for open data practices, even as he received interest from parties who preferred secrecy. He wrote about the ethics of study design, about the danger of overclaiming, and about the weight of responsibility when working with communities whose traditions had already been marginalized. These personal archival traces complicate the simplistic caricature of a radical researcher seduced by exotic claims. They show instead a practitioner who tried, by temperament and training, to hold rigor and respect together. When investigators later sought to connect specific documents to the disappearance, the evidence resisted tidy classification. There were memos mentioning interest in certain researchers and program notes that hinted at exploratory funding streams, but the documents rarely, if ever, authorized extraordinary actions such as covert abduction. The procedural machinery required to move from curiosity to clandestine intervention is large and visible. Absent clear, unequivocal documentation, the archive supports only a theory of interest rather than a theory of action. This modest conclusion is important. Institutions can be curious without having executed dramatic conclusions, and an archival trace is not the same as a chain of orders. Despite this sober assessment, the presence of Jacobo's work in these files mattered in real ways. Funding offers arrived in forms that required a judgment call: accept aid from sources that demand secrecy, or continue slowly with limited resources while preserving openness and academic independence. The choices researchers make when offered institutional support inevitably change the trajectory of their projects. Jacobo's notes show he weighed these matters carefully. The tension between accepting resources and maintaining scholarly transparency haunted the margins of his plans. That human tension between the immediacy of practical support and the long-term ethic of public science is at the center of many Cold War-era narratives and sits quietly in this one as well. As the years passed, scholars and journalists who pieced together these records produced a narrative that balanced two feelings: amazement at human curiosity and a wariness about the seductive simplicity of conspiratorial explanations. The documents provided raw material for careful historians, but did not collapse the space of mystery. They asked readers to hold both the presence of institutional interest and the absence of definitive proof at the same time. Beyond the files themselves, other archival traces mattered: taped interviews, field recordings, and contemporary newspaper accounts that reflected how the story entered popular imagination. Pachita's ceremonies, Jacobo's books, and the later television appeals by his daughter were all parts of a living archive that shaped public memory. These materials allowed later researchers to triangulate, matching memos with dates, with newspaper reports, and with personal accounts, to build a more textured narrative. Yet triangulation is never perfect. Eyewitness memory shifts, public coverage simplifies, archival cataloguing creates accidental silences. These are the human limitations that the archive exposes, and they invite a gentle patience rather than a rush to certain conclusions. For those who continued to study Jacobo's work, the challenge was practical: how to extract future-facing scientific lessons from a partially available past. The answer involved two threads. One was methodological. Modern teams revisited his experiments with contemporary technology: denser EEG arrays, stricter blinding, automated artifact rejection, and millisecond accurate synchronization across labs. These methodological upgrades allowed researchers to probe the phenomenon of shared attention in ways Jacobo could only sketch. What they found was precise and modest. Meditative pairs often show correlated brain rhythms, aligned breathing, and synchronized heart rates when engaged in shared practices. These are replicable findings that sit squarely within accepted social neuroscience. They do not, however, demonstrate dramatic physical transmutations. The modern data suggests that Grinberg's most robust legacy may be the demonstration that human attention can be socially entrained, and that such entrainment produces measurable physiological signatures. The other thread was anthropological: to preserve and learn from the cultural practices Jacobo recorded. Those field notes, ritual descriptions, and community testimonies contain knowledge about ritual structure, attention training, and social context that modern cognitive science can investigate without exoticizing. Scholars have worked to translate ritual techniques into controlled training protocols, breathing patterns, rhythmic chanting, and symbolic enactments that reliably produce altered states measurable by EEG and physiological sensors. In this translational work, the humane core of Grinberg's project survived: his insistence that tradition be studied, not dismissed, and that methods gleaned from community practice could enrich scientific understanding of attention and perception. There is, finally, an archival ethics to this whole story. Families and communities have rights to the materials that concern them. Researchers have responsibilities to avoid converting sacred practices into commodities, and historians must avoid turning ambiguous absences into definitive accusations. Throughout the years, good archivists and careful scholars have tried to honour those responsibilities, preserving what can be preserved, making declassified materials available with contextual notes, and acknowledging the limits of inference when evidence is partial. As this quiet chapter reaches its close, allow a small thought to settle. Archives do not resolve the deepest mysteries of life. They illuminate the seams and patterns in which those mysteries are woven. Jacobo's papers, what survived and what did not, are part of a larger human story about curiosity, institutional interest, cultural respect, and the ethical hazards of mixing science and secrecy. The files teach us restraint as much as they teach us facts. They ask us to keep looking, but to look with careful methods, patient replication, and respect for the people and traditions at the heart of the inquiry. In the next chapter, we will follow the living threads of Grinberg's legacy. The scientists who continued similar lines of research, the meditators who adapted ritual techniques for lab settings, and the families who kept memory alive. We will talk to the people who refused to let the story end with absence, and we will listen to how their quiet persistence reshaped the questions he first asked. Chapter 9: How Jacobo's questions kept growing. After a disappearance, lives usually split into two stories: the official record that gathers facts, and the living memory that keeps asking the question. In Jacobo's case, the living memory became a small, persistent movement of people who refused to let his notebooks be the last word. Some of them were scientists who adapted his experimental instincts to new tools. Some were meditators and ritual practitioners who translated communal practices into training protocols that a laboratory could measure without disrespecting the tradition. Others were family members, students, and curious strangers who kept his ideas in conversation, debating, testing, and quietly carrying his questions forward. Together these threads formed an afterglow, not a blazing revival, but a steady warmth that warmed new rooms of inquiry. The first group to watch were the researchers who saw in Jacobo's early EEG work a seed worth tending with modern methods. Technology had moved forward since the 1980s and 1990s. Denser electrode arrays, better artifact rejection algorithms, synchronized time servers that let labs coordinate with millisecond accuracy, and open data practices that made replication more feasible. Scientists interested in social neuroscience began to explore the idea of inter-brain synchrony, the measurable alignment of neural rhythms among people who interact, sing together, or meditate together. Where Jacobo had recorded small, suggestive echoes, later researchers could record entire patterns, matched alpha rhythms when groups listened to the same music, phase-locked theta during shared storytelling, and correlated gamma bursts in tightly coordinated tasks. These results did not confirm dramatic claims about matter spontaneously appearing, but they did show, with calm rigour, that attention shared in a group has physiological signatures that can be measured and replicated. Alongside those technical advances, a methodological culture shifted. Where once lone labs published intriguing but isolated reports, new projects focused on pre-registered protocols, larger sample sizes, and open repositories for raw data. This change addressed the very criticism Grinberg had faced: the need to make results robust against statistical quirks and replication failures. With these better practices, many teams reproduced the basic pattern he noticed. People practicing shared intention exhibit measurable coordination in heart rate, respiration, and neural oscillation. These are subtle effects, not deterministic keys that open reality like a lock, but reliable signatures of social attunement. Understanding them has practical value in fields such as group therapy, education, and performance training, where coordinated attention matters. Another strand of the legacy was anthropological and humanistic in nature. Scholars who admired Jacobo's sensitivity to local practice worked to preserve ethnographies he had written, and to collect new ones with ethical care. They translated ritual structures into elements that cognitive scientists could test, without stripping rituals of their meaning. Breathing patterns, chant rhythms, the timing of touch and eye contact all became measurable variables. In doing this work, researchers were careful to maintain the dignity of practitioners. Consent, co-authorship, and cultural stewardship became central principles. The result was a new type of cross-cultural research that took both laboratory rigour and cultural context seriously, a practice Jacobo had tried to model, though he had had fewer tools to do it with. A third thread came from practitioners themselves. Meditation centres and ritual communities that had been part of Jacobo's fieldwork adapted training modules that brought ritual efficiencies into practice sessions explicitly designed for reproducible studies. Meditation teachers learned to structure a shared visual frame, to time breath cycles precisely, and to use synchronized cues that could be compared across sites. The language of shared intentionality entered both academic papers and workshop descriptions, and the two worlds, lab and temple, began to talk more easily to one another. This practical collaboration produced calm, useful outcomes, groups that could deepen mutual attunement, improve cooperative tasks, and cultivate forms of presence that felt subjectively meaningful and measurable in physiological terms. The family and local community played a quieter but no less important role. Jacobo's daughter and close friends organised readings, archived what remained of his notes, and invited sympathetic scholars to examine the materials. Rather than trying to build sensational claims from small data, these caretakers urged careful preservation, scanning notebooks, recording interviews with people Jacobo had worked with, and insisting that any public claim about the experiments respect the nuances and limits of the evidence. That ethic of careful stewardship kept the conversation honest and, in time, made his archive a source for cautious, well-contextualized study rather than a shrine for sensationalism. There were also creative echoes. Artists, writers, and filmmakers found in Jacobo's life a rich seam of metaphor. A scientist straddling two worlds, rituals that bind communities, and the uneasy border where meaning and measurement meet. These creative works did something important. They reframed scientific curiosity as a humane quest, inviting audiences who might not read journals to ask the same questions about attention, embodiment, and cultural practice. That broader cultural interest, while not scientific proof, made the questions polite and persistent in the public imagination, encouraging new collaborations and funding in subtle ways. It is important to name what did not happen, calmly and without disappointment. The dramatic proof of minds conjuring physical organs into being did not emerge from subsequent research. Modern teams could not reproduce the kinds of materializations that some witnesses described, and the more extraordinary claims remained anecdotal rather than evidenced. But if the original hope was to show the universe as a programmable substrate manipulated by intention, that program did not complete in the way some imagined. The more tempered outcome, that shared attention produces replicable physiological and neural signatures with important social consequences, proved to be the more scientifically sustainable gift. This quieter legacy also comes with ethical lessons. Jacobo's life illustrates the risks of taking one's empirical curiosity into political or secretive arenas. Scholars who followed learned to be explicit about funding sources, about ethical review procedures, and about the dangers of mixing public science with covert agendas. The modern field emphasizes transparency for good reason. Openness reduces the risk that curiosity becomes co-opted into uses a researcher would not endorse. Jacobo's story became a case study for training programs. Be bold in asking questions, rigorous in designing tests, and cautious about whom you let sit at your table. For viewers of this story, there is a slow, humane lesson. The absence of final answers does not mean the end of value. What Jacobo left behind was not a single unambiguous proof, but a set of questions, methods, and ethical concerns that helped shape a field. The most robust legacy is not the mythic vanishing, but the careful, incremental work that followed. People who tested his ideas with modern tools, traditions that were studied with respect, and an archive maintained with dignity by family and friends. Those aftershocks are the true measure of a life devoted to inquiry. As night deepens and our story slows, imagine a workshop where scientists and meditators sit together around a low table, comparing notes on respiration patterns and entrainment. Picture a careful technician aligning clocks between two distant labs, the slow click of synchronized recordings marking a project built from patience. Picture a daughter reviewing her father's typed notes, tracing the loops where he tried to explain something he felt but could not fully prove. These are ordinary human images, small, steady work that moves knowledge forward without spectacle. In the next chapter, we will return to personal voices, interviews with people who knew Jacobo, testimonies from meditators who participated in his experiments, and reflections from scientists who built on his work. We will let their memories breathe, letting tenderness and professional judgment sit beside one another. For now, rest in the knowledge that the questions he asked continue to be asked, and that patient, careful work has turned curiosity into a field where meaningful, replicable insights can grow. Chapter 10: Testimonies, Reflections, and the Human Side of the Mystery. When documents have been read and experiments reanalyzed, what remains most vivid are the voices of people who lived through the story. Numbers and EEG traces may show patterns, but the texture of Jacobo's life, what it felt like to work with him, to sit in his presence, to watch him balance scientific rigor with deep cultural curiosity, comes most clearly through testimony. These voices are neither mere anecdotes nor absolute evidence. They are human windows, fragments of memory that let us glimpse the emotional resonance of a man, and a mystery that official records alone cannot capture. One recurring testimony comes from students who described Jacobo's teaching style. They remembered a professor who demanded clarity and precision, but also allowed space for imagination. He often began lectures by asking students to write down not what they knew, but what they wondered. "Curiosity is our instrument," one student recalled him saying, "and we must keep it tuned." In laboratory work, he could be meticulous, double-checking electrodes, repeating calibration sequences, correcting sloppy record-keeping. Yet when the technical work was done, he encouraged discussion that opened into philosophy, poetry, and ritual. His students remembered this balance as electrifying, the sense that rigorous data and expansive imagination could sit side by side. Colleagues offered more complicated memories. Some admired his courage in tackling controversial topics, noting that he risked professional marginalization by studying shamans and unorthodox practices at a time when neuroscience was striving for harder, more reductionist credibility. Others admitted frustration with what they considered speculative leaps in his writings, moments when poetic language blurred with empirical claims. For these colleagues, the unresolved disappearance added a layer of poignancy. Disagreements that could never be clarified, debates that could never be continued. In their testimonies, one hears both admiration and unfinished argument, a reminder that intellectual life is made of dialogues, not monologues. Among the most compelling testimonies are those of participants in his experiments. Several meditators spoke years later about the experience of being connected to electrodes, of sitting in stillness while trying to send or receive an image or a word. Some described subtle sensations, a warmth, a fleeting mental picture, or the uncanny sense of being accompanied in silence. Others reported nothing unusual at all, only the slow breathing and the hum of equipment. What these testimonies reveal is the variety of subjective experience. Just as in any human practice, not everyone felt the same. For Jacobo, this variety was not failure, it was data. He believed that some participants would be more sensitive than others, that training mattered, and that the subjective reports, when aligned with physiological measurements, offered a richer picture than either alone. There were also testimonies from people who knew him outside the laboratory. Friends remembered a man who loved music and long conversations, who enjoyed humour and good food, and who carried with him an air of intensity even in casual settings. Some spoke of his generosity, mentoring young people who felt adrift. Others remembered his solitude, the long hours in his study, the sense of a man who carried questions too heavy to share fully. These personal reflections remind us that Jacobo was not only a researcher, but a husband, father, and friend, roles that bring their own complexities and contradictions. Family testimonies are perhaps the most difficult and most moving. His daughter has spoken about the ache of absence, about growing up with both pride in her father's work and frustration at the lack of answers. She's described searching through his papers, listening to others' recollections, and feeling at times that she was piecing together not only a biography, but also a mosaic of myth and memory. Her testimony highlights what all disappearances leave behind, not only unanswered questions, but also a responsibility carried by those who remain to hold memory with dignity even when clarity is denied. From the investigators, we also hear voices. Officer Padilla, the detective who pursued the case with seriousness until he was removed, left behind a testimony of frustration, a man convinced that leads were cut short, that institutional decisions prevented a full investigation. His voice, steady and professional, nonetheless carries the weight of unfinished duty. He once said in an interview that this was the one case that haunted him, not because of sensational theories, but because he felt the ordinary duty of justice had not been fully allowed. In his words, one hears the tension between individual conscience and institutional constraint. Even skeptics contribute valuable testimony. Some scientists who reviewed his experiments later expressed doubt, arguing that small signals could be explained by artifacts or statistical quirks. Their voices, while critical, also show respect. They acknowledged his sincerity, his competence, and his passion, even as they disagreed with his conclusions. These testimonies are crucial because they ground the story, reminding us that skepticism is not hostility, but part of the scientific process. Taken together, these voices create a chorus, not a single song. They do not resolve the disappearance, but they enrich our sense of the man and the world he inhabited. They show us a teacher who inspired, a colleague who provoked, a friend who comforted, a father whose absence still wounds, an investigator who grieved unfinished work, and a skeptic who demanded rigor. These are not contradictions, they are the facets of a human life. If we pause here, breathing slowly, we can notice what these testimonies teach beyond the case itself. They remind us that knowledge is never only about data. It is about relationships, about the way a teacher shapes a student's courage to wonder, about the way a friend's laughter softens long nights, about the way a detective's persistence becomes an ethical stand. Testimonies are the living part of history, carrying warmth that documents alone cannot hold. In the quiet of the present, we can imagine these voices gathered in a circle, each one offering their piece. None has the whole, but together they form a human mosaic of memory and meaning. This is the true afterlife of a life devoted to inquiry. Not only the experiments and the publications, but the way people remember, the way they continue the questions, and the way they honor the absence by refusing to let it be silence. In the next chapter, we will turn to the wider cultural landscape, how Jacobo's disappearance and his ideas echoed beyond immediate circles, how they shaped public imagination, and how myths grew around him in literature, media, and popular belief. For now, let us rest with the voices of those who knew him, breathing with their memories, allowing the warmth of testimony to balance the coolness of documents. Chapter 11. Public Imagination, Myth, and Cultural Memory. When the immediate facts of Jacobo's disappearance had settled into unresolved silence, something remarkable began to unfold. In the vacuum of certainty, the public imagination rushed in, weaving threads of fact, speculation, and yearning into stories that would outlive the man himself. What had started as a case file in Mexico soon expanded into folklore, a narrative that crossed borders, disciplines, and generations. This transformation from scientist and missing person into legend is as telling as any official record. It reveals how human beings respond to mystery, not by leaving it empty, but by filling it with meaning. In Mexico, the earliest responses were intimate and emotional. Students gathered in small circles on university lawns, remembering his lectures and speculating on his fate. In these gatherings, certain themes emerged. Some were convinced he'd been silenced for political reasons. Others whispered of his experiments attracting attention from powerful groups who did not wish such ideas to flourish. Still, others took a more spiritual stance, suggesting that Jacobo himself had crossed into the very dimension he studied, that he had become a kind of traveller beyond the brain's ordinary map. These conversations, repeated in classrooms, cafes, and family living rooms, seeded the myth that would grow in public consciousness. As months turned into years, Jacobo's name began appearing in articles, interviews, and eventually books. Some writers framed him as a visionary, silenced by orthodoxy, echoing a long tradition in which pioneers of unorthodox thought are cast as martyrs. Others cast him as a mystical figure, a scientist shaman who blurred the boundary between laboratory and sacred space. In newspapers and magazines, the tension between skepticism and fascination was clear. While some journalists insisted that his disappearance was a tragic but ordinary crime, others hinted at something larger, something uncanny, something that seemed to defy neat explanation. In cultural memory, such ambiguity is fertile ground. Over time, Jacobo entered the realm of Mexican intellectual folklore, alongside figures like Sor Juan Inés de la Cruz or Octavio Paz, not because his scientific work reached the same level of fame, but because his story resonated with deeper cultural patterns. Mexico has always held a complex relationship with mystery, blending scientific rationality with indigenous spirituality and Catholic symbolism. In this context, Jacobo became a liminal figure, a man of science who dared to explore dimensions of consciousness that resonated with shamanic traditions, and whose disappearance felt like a ritual passage. Art responded as well. Painters created canvases inspired by his work, often depicting human brains intertwined with cosmic landscapes, electrodes turning into vines, or figures dissolving into light. Poets wrote verses that compared his silence to a mirror, a place where the world peers at itself. Even musicians composed pieces inspired by his themes, blending electronic tones with indigenous instruments to evoke the dialogue between modern science and ancient ritual. These creative responses did not attempt to solve the disappearance. They transformed it into cultural symbol. Meanwhile, television and radio amplified his image further. Documentaries speculated on his fate, often presenting him in dramatic tones, surrounded by mystery. Some programs leaned toward conspiracy, suggesting involvement of clandestine groups. Others leaned toward mysticism, hinting that his experiments had opened doors that could not be closed. Audiences, already fascinated by the thin line between science and the supernatural, embraced these portrayals. In living rooms across Mexico and beyond, Jacobo was no longer only a neuroscientist. He was becoming a mythic character in a national and global imagination. The myth spread internationally as well. In academic conferences abroad, his disappearance was mentioned in hushed tones, sometimes as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pursuing controversial topics, sometimes as a rallying cry for intellectual freedom. In spiritual communities, particularly those interested in meditation and consciousness studies, Jacobo's name became an emblem of scientific validation for practices long dismissed by mainstream science. His absence gave his presence more weight. People projected into the void their hopes, fears, and beliefs. What makes myths powerful is not their factual accuracy, but their symbolic resonance. In Jacobo's case, the myth touched on several universal themes. First, the theme of the seeker who vanishes, a motif found in many cultures, from shamans who journey to other realms to prophets who disappear into the desert. Second, the theme of silenced knowledge, echoing stories of suppressed wisdom throughout history. And third, the theme of transcendence, the idea that Jacobo's disappearance was not an ending but a crossing, a passage into the very mystery he studied. Yet, Myths are double-edged. While they preserve memory and inspire reflection, they can also obscure the person behind them. For Jacobo's family, the mythologizing was painful. They wanted answers, not legends. To them, he was not only a cultural symbol, but a father, a husband, a man whose absence was felt in daily routines. This tension between the public myth and the private grief became part of the larger story, reminding us that legends grow from real lives with real wounds. Despite this, the cultural memory of Jacobo continues to thrive. His writings remain in circulation, his name sparks curiosity, and his disappearance continues to inspire new generations of thinkers, artists, and seekers. Some engage with him as a symbol of resistance against intellectual conformity, others as a beacon of spiritual scientific dialogue, and still others simply as a haunting mystery that refuses closure. If we take a step back, we can see how this process of myth-making is itself a natural human response to uncertainty. When confronted with the unknown, we tell stories, not because stories replace truth, but because they help us live with what we cannot resolve. In the case of Jacobo, the story became larger than the man. It became a mirror for cultural longings, anxieties, and hopes. As night deepens and we allow our breathing to slow, we might imagine the quiet persistence of this legend. In one corner of the world, a student reads his book and feels a spark of curiosity. In another, an artist paints a vision inspired by his disappearance. Somewhere else, a family member lights a candle in memory, not of a legend, but of a loved one. This is how myth and memory intertwine, not replacing each other, but overlapping, creating a layered resonance that continues to echo through time. In the next chapter, we will turn toward the broader philosophical reflections that arise from this story. Beyond the mystery of one man, what does this narrative teach us about human consciousness, the boundaries of knowledge, and the way we respond to the unknown? For now, we rest with the awareness that Jacobo is no longer only a person or a case. He's a symbol carried in imagination, a presence woven into cultural memory, and a legend born from silence. Chapter 12: Consciousness, Mystery, and the Limits of Human Knowledge. The story of Jacobo's life and disappearance leads us into a deeper meditation. What is it, exactly, that we mean when we speak of consciousness? And why does it provoke such profound fascination and unease? His work did not merely explore brain waves or meditation techniques. It opened the door to one of the most enduring questions in human history: whether the human mind is only a product of biological machinery, or whether it extends into dimensions that science has yet to grasp. By following the contours of his research and the myths that grew around him, we arrive at a threshold where neuroscience meets philosophy, and where culture meets the eternal mystery of existence. Consciousness, in its simplest description, is awareness, the capacity to experience, to feel, to think, to know that one is alive. Yet this simplicity is deceptive, because when we examine it closely, consciousness eludes precise definition. Scientists can describe neural activity, they can track electrical signals and chemical exchanges, but the subjective quality, the inner world of experience, is not so easily captured. This is what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness. Why do neural processes produce experience at all? Why does a flow of ions across cell membranes create the sensation of colour, the memory of a song, or the ache of longing? Jacobo stood at the edge of this problem. His experiments with shamans and meditators suggested that consciousness might not be confined to the skull. Instead, he speculated it might extend or resonate in ways we do not fully understand. He did not claim to have proven this, but he dared to ask the question within a scientific frame. This daring is what made his work controversial and what later fueled the myth of his disappearance. For if consciousness is more than biology, if it touches a larger field, then the implications stretch across science, philosophy and spirituality alike. To make this easier to grasp, we can think in terms of metaphors. Imagine the brain as a radio receiver. Traditional neuroscience tells us the receiver both generates and processes signals. But what if, Jacobo suggested, the receiver is not the source of all the music, it simply tunes into something larger? In this metaphor, when the receiver is damaged, the music may distort, but the music itself continues in the airwaves. Such a model does not deny the importance of biology, but it places consciousness in a wider field, just as light can exist beyond the visible spectrum. This is a powerful, unsettling idea, that human awareness might be a local expression of a universal property. Throughout history, many traditions have spoken of consciousness in this broader sense. Indigenous shamans, Indian yogis, African diviners, and mystical thinkers from countless cultures have described states of awareness that expand beyond the individual self. They speak of visions, shared dreams, or communion with forces larger than themselves. Jacobo's work can be seen as part of this lineage, but with electrodes and recording devices as his ritual tools. He sought not to replace ancient wisdom, but to test it in a modern framework, to bridge worlds that are often kept apart. Yet science resists leaps beyond the measurable. Critics reminded him that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The anomalies he recorded, synchronizations between distant brains, unusual EEG patterns, might be chance, artifacts, or suggestive but inconclusive. This caution is necessary. Without it, science risks dissolving into speculation. But even as caution restrains, it also leaves us with the enduring mystery. Why do so many cultures, separated by geography and time, describe consciousness as more than individual biology? Is this convergence coincidence, or does it hint at something deeper? The limits of human knowledge appear most clearly here. Our instruments are powerful, but partial. Microscopes and telescopes extend our senses, but they too have boundaries. Consciousness, being both inner and outer, presents a unique challenge. It is not only observed from outside, but lived from within. This dual perspective makes it resistant to reduction. We can measure brainwaves, but we cannot fully measure what it feels like to love, to mourn, to wonder. Jacobo's disappearance thus becomes symbolic, a reminder that certain mysteries remain at the edge of what can be captured, inviting us to humility as much as curiosity. To make this more concrete, consider dreams. Every night, the human brain generates entire worlds, landscapes, conversations, dramas that vanish upon waking. We can observe REM sleep, chart eye movements, and record brain activity. Yet the lived world of the dream, the mountain, the stranger, the river, exists in a realm science cannot fully enter. It is at once utterly real to the dreamer and utterly elusive to the researcher. This gap is similar to the gap Jacobo confronted in his work, between measurable data and lived experience, between brain as machine and mind as mystery. Philosophy has long grappled with these questions. From Descartes' "I think therefore I am," to contemporary debates on panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe, thinkers have wrestled with whether mind emerges from matter, or whether matter itself is already infused with mind. Jacobo's experiments do not solve this debate, but they bring it into sharper focus. They remind us that scientific exploration and philosophical reflection are not enemies but partners, each grounding and expanding the other. As we reflect on this, it becomes clear why Jacobo's story touches such a deep chord. His disappearance is not only the absence of a person, It is the embodiment of a question. Where does consciousness end? What are the boundaries of knowledge? How do we navigate the tension between skepticism and wonder? These are questions that belong not only to science, but to every human being who has ever paused to ask, who am I, and what is the nature of the awareness asking the question? As night surrounds us and our breathing deepens, we might picture consciousness not as a riddle to be solved, but as a horizon to be approached. Jacobo reached toward that horizon, and though he vanished, the questions he raised remain luminous. Perhaps that is the truest legacy, not definitive answers, but the courage to explore the unknown. In the next chapter, we will turn from the philosophical to the existential. What does Jacobo's disappearance teach us about the fragility of human life, the persistence of memory, and the way mystery shapes the human condition itself? For now, let us rest with the awareness that consciousness, so close, so familiar, and yet so mysterious, remains one of the greatest frontiers we carry within us. Chapter 13: Fragility, Mystery, and the Meaning We Create. When we speak of Jacobo's disappearance, when we turn the puzzle over and over in our minds, what we're also confronting is something universal: the fragility of the human condition and the strange way that mystery shapes our lives. His absence is not only the story of one man, but a mirror held up to all of us, reflecting how we face uncertainty, how we wrestle with mortality, and how we create meaning in the face of the unknown. To follow his story deeply is to explore not just neuroscience, not just myth, but the very essence of what it means to be human. Human life is always fragile. From the moment of birth, we live under the knowledge, sometimes conscious, sometimes buried, that life is temporary. Accidents happen, illnesses strike, and sometimes people vanish without explanation. This awareness is both a burden and a gift. It makes us anxious, but it also makes life precious. We value moments, relationships, and discoveries precisely because we know they are finite. Jacobo's story is a stark reminder of this. A man so deeply involved in exploring the mysteries of consciousness, so full of curiosity and promise, was suddenly cut off, leaving behind questions that will never be fully answered. His fate reminds us of how delicate every life truly is, no matter how brilliant or passionate. But fragility is not the end of the story. Human beings are not only fragile, we are also meaning makers. When faced with uncertainty, we do not stop at silence. We tell stories, we build rituals, we create art, we weave memory into narrative, transforming chaos into something that can be carried. This is what we see in the testimonies of his students, in the art inspired by his life, in the myths that grew around his disappearance. Whether or not those myths are factually true, they serve a purpose. They allow people to live with the unknown, to hold absence without being crushed by it. This act of meaning-making is not unique to Jacobo's story. It is part of the human condition everywhere. When a loved one dies, families gather, tell stories, light candles, and sing songs. When communities face tragedy, they build memorials, write books, compose music. These are not merely distractions, they are essential acts of survival. They allow human beings to transform grief into remembrance, uncertainty into continuity, fragility into strength. Jacobo's disappearance, unresolved as it is, has become one of these collective acts of meaning-making. It is why his name is remembered not only as a case file, but as a cultural symbol. There is also the deeper layer of mystery itself. Human beings are unique among animals in our ability to ask not only how things work, but why they are at all. We gaze at the stars and wonder about infinity. We stare into silence and wonder about the soul. We watch someone vanish into the unknown and cannot stop ourselves from asking where they have gone. Mystery is therefore not an obstacle to life. It is part of what gives life texture. Without mystery, existence would be flat, mechanical, predictable. With mystery, it becomes charged with possibility, with awe, with questions that push us beyond our limits. Jacobo's story embodies this truth. It forces us to live with a mystery that cannot be solved, reminding us that some questions remain open, not to frustrate us, but to awaken us. There is a paradox here. On the one hand, human beings long for certainty. We want answers, closure, resolution. On the other hand, we are drawn to mystery, to stories that refuse to end neatly. It is why myths endure, why sacred texts are studied for centuries, why works of art are interpreted again and again. The unsolved keeps us searching, keeps us alive to wonder. Jacobo's disappearance, painful as it is, sits precisely in this paradox. For his family, the lack of answers is a wound. For culture, the lack of answers is what makes the story endure. Both realities coexist, reminding us that mystery is both suffering and inspiration. At a more intimate level, this story asks each of us to reflect on our own fragility. If someone as dedicated, as curious, as engaged as Jacobo could vanish so suddenly, what about us? What will remain of our lives when we are gone? What stories will people tell about us, and what meanings will they create from our absence? These questions are uncomfortable, but they are also clarifying. They remind us to live in such a way that when we are remembered, it is with warmth, inspiration, or gratitude. They remind us that every day is both ordinary and extraordinary, fragile and infinite. In this sense, Jacobo's life and disappearance can be seen as a lesson, not in a didactic way, but in a quiet, existential way. The lesson is that fragility is not something to be feared, but embraced. That mystery is not something to be erased, but lived with. That meaning is not something waiting to be discovered, but something we create together through memory, story, and imagination. As we breathe slowly and let these reflections settle, we might picture ourselves sitting by a river. The water flows, sometimes clear, sometimes murky, always moving. We cannot hold the river in our hands, but we can listen to its sound, watch its surface, feel its coolness. Life is like this. Consciousness is like this. Jacobo's story is like this. Fragile, flowing, mysterious, yet deeply real. In the next chapter, we will move from the existential to the universal. We will explore how Jacobo's disappearance and the themes it embodies, consciousness, mystery, fragility, and meaning, connect to humanity's oldest stories, to myths and philosophies that stretch across cultures and centuries. For now, we sit with the awareness that our condition, though fragile, is also luminous, and that mystery, though unsettling, is also the source of meaning. Chapter 14. Humanity's Oldest Stories. Jacobo's disappearance may seem like a modern story, set in the age of neuroscience and urban life, but beneath its surface it carries echoes of something ancient. For as long as humans have walked the earth, we have wrestled with the same questions his life and absence embody. What is consciousness? What happens when someone vanishes into the unknown? How do we live with mystery, fragility, and the limits of knowledge? The answers humanity has given to these questions form the great tapestry of myth, philosophy, and religion. A tapestry into which Jacobo's story is now woven, whether we recognize it or not. If we look back to the earliest myths, we see the theme of disappearance repeated again and again. In the myths of the ancient Greeks, heroes like Orpheus and Odysseus journey to the underworld, vanishing from the world of the living before returning with stories of what lies beyond. In the traditions of the Maya, shamans are said to enter other realms through trance, leaving their bodies behind to commune with spirits. In African cosmologies, figures who cross thresholds between the seen and unseen are revered as messengers, those who remind us that life extends beyond the visible. In each case, disappearance is not merely loss, it is transformation, a passage into mystery. Jacobo's story resonates with these traditions, though he did not set out to be a mythic figure. His work with shamans in Mexico, his attention to meditation and altered states, placed him in direct conversation with traditions much older than modern science. He sought to measure with electrodes what others had long described through ritual and vision. When he disappeared, it was as if life itself folded him into the very archetype he studied, the seeker who steps across the boundary and does not return. This is why his story has power beyond the facts. It feels archetypal, as though it belongs to humanity's oldest memory. Philosophy, too, provides a lens for this story. Thinkers from Plato to Descartes, from Eastern sages to modern philosophers of mind, have asked whether consciousness is material or transcendent. Plato spoke of the soul remembering truths from before birth, suggesting that knowledge itself is a kind of recollection from a higher plane. Eastern philosophies such as Hinduism and Buddhism describe consciousness as fundamental, a vast ocean of awareness in which individual minds are like waves. In the modern era, philosophers wrestle with whether mind can be reduced to brain or whether it points to something more. Jacobo's research sits at the intersection of these traditions, rooted in scientific method yet brushing against ancient metaphysical questions. We can also see echoes of religious narratives. In Christianity, figures like Enoch and Elijah are said to have vanished, taken up into another realm without dying. In Islam, stories abound of prophets who travel in spirit beyond the limits of the body. In indigenous traditions across the Americas, medicine men and women undertake journeys into the invisible world to bring back knowledge or healing. Though the contexts differ, the underlying theme is constant, the human belief that consciousness is not confined to the body, that there are passages beyond what eyes can see. Jacobo's disappearance has been read by some in this same light, not simply as tragedy, but as a crossing into mystery. Why do these themes repeat across cultures and centuries? One reason is that they respond to a universal human need. We cannot bear to think of life as meaningless, of disappearance as final erasure. Instead, we create stories that extend life, that place it within a larger whole. These stories do not erase grief. Rather, they give it a frame. They allow us to live with mystery by transforming it into narrative. This is why, when faced with Jacobo's absence, people did not remain silent. They placed him in the long line of seekers and prophets, of shamans and visionaries, of thinkers who step beyond and leave us with questions. At the same time, these myths and philosophies do not remove the responsibility of science or reason. Jacobo himself would likely have insisted on careful distinction between empirical data and symbolic meaning. Yet he also knew that human beings live in both worlds, the world of evidence and the world of story. The brain seeks patterns, but the heart seeks meaning. To honour both is not to confuse them, but to let them enrich each other. This duality is itself part of the human condition. We are creatures of fact and creatures of myth, beings who build telescopes to study galaxies and altars to honour ancestors. We read scientific journals and sacred texts, sometimes in the same day, sometimes with the same thirst. Jacobo's story shows us that these impulses are not opposites but companions. His electrodes and his encounters with shamans were two ways of approaching the same mystery, the mystery of consciousness and its boundaries. When we step back, we can see how his disappearance now belongs not only to his family, not only to Mexico, but to humanity's collective imagination. It stands alongside the oldest stories, reminding us that even in the age of modern science, we are still the same species that once told tales around the fire, gazing into the dark and wondering what lies beyond. His story reminds us that science and myth are not enemies but parts of one great conversation, each illuminating what the other cannot. As night deepens and our breath slows, we might imagine those ancient stories gathering with Jacobos, Orpheus walking into the underworld, shamans entering trance, prophets vanishing into the sky, and Jacobo, a neuroscientist with electrodes and notebooks, stepping into silence. All of them are voices in the same chorus, reminding us that human beings are defined not only by knowledge but by mystery, not only by answers but by questions.